Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Benn from Tortoise, and I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's ThinkIn with the one and only Jess Phillips. If you haven't been to a ThinkIn before, welcome. And if you have, welcome back. You will have got the code of conduct for our ThinkIns in your tickets, or it's on the Tortoise website. We are really keen, as ever, that everyone has their chance to contribute. My colleague, Marks and Andrew, nice to see there's already love for Marks and Andrew in the chat, is moderating. So please make your contributions. I will bring in as many of you as possible. And I'm sure the hour will go all too quickly. I am really pleased that our guest tonight is Jess Phillips, MP for Birmingham Yardley, author extraordinaire, political campaigner, particularly against domestic abuse and violence, and much more besides. She's here tonight to talk specifically about her book, and Mark has put a link in the chat. Everything you really need to know about politics. And having read it over the last few days, I really recommend it, not least because it is unbelievably funny. Lots of those anecdotes I hope we will come to over the course of the evening. But Jess, firstly, a big hello. Welcome back to Tortoise. Thank you for coming back. And I gather that we see you just from a stint at Latitude.
Yes, I've been in the first, I felt like I have to make this sound historic, the first music festival since the last one, which isn't that historic, but since 2019, I think. So yeah, I've just come back, and it felt quite historic at first, and then it felt like all festivals that you've ever been to. But it was good fun. It was good fun. I had a really good fun. Bill Bailey woke me up one evening, arriving to his tent very late in the night. And you know, when you wake up in a tent, you can just hear lots of like commotion. And I started to be like, and then I thought that sounds like Bill Bailey, and it was.
And you got to see Rick Astley. I mean, how much more do you want in a weekend?
Got to see Rick Astley, who was much better than people think that he might be. I mean, you might be a big Rick Astley fan, but let me tell you, it was a better show than I was expecting. My son basically wanted us to go and watch it because he likes to rickroll us and play Never Gonna Give You Up constantly. But it was a genuinely good show.
I am absolutely delighted. So this is your third book in 3 years, unless I'm much mistaken.
Well, I think it's more than 3 years, isn't it? The first one came out in 2016. Come on, it's 5 years.
Okay, 5 years. Okay, sorry. Still, I mean, it's still a lot of books in quite a short space of time.
Barbara Cartland. And when I wrote my first book, I said, I'm not going to be like Barbara Cartland, just churning out books. But it turns out I am like Barbara Cartland. But Barbara Cartland was from Birmingham, and she lived in the same bit of Birmingham that she comes from, the same bit of Birmingham that I come from. And at school, I was in Cartland House. So maybe I am due to be like Barbara Cartland.
Right. So, and there were worse people to follow in their footsteps of. What made you, after your first two, what made you want to write this one?
So what the main inspiration for it is my husband, Tom, although the book is not dedicated to him because I dedicated my second book to him and I don't think he's ever read it. And when I showed it to him, he just sort of went, oh, thanks, yeah. I thought, God, if somebody dedicated a book to me, I would be much more chuffed. Anyway, when I became a member of Parliament, my husband is a lift engineer by trade. And you know, he's typical white man, but he's quite political, but he's not a member of a political party or anything. But he cares about politics and he has strong opinions about things. But he said I had absolutely no idea of half of the stuff that you do. I had absolutely no idea what the job of an MP actually was. I thought it was basically sort of like a half an hour a week at Prime Minister's Questions. I thought that was essentially it. I didn't realise all the things that people expect of you wrongly. I didn't realise all the stuff that you can do, all the stuff that you can't do. And I just thought, well, if he didn't, and you know, I've been a political activist the whole time we've been together, it's not particularly new to him. If he didn't know that stuff, then I thought most people don't. And a lot of the time on Twitter and in emails and on Facebook and things, people will say things to you like quite accusatory, like, why aren't you doing this? Like, why isn't this happening? And it's just sort of like so maddening, not because they're wrong and they're stupid, it's because I think that in lots of cases they think that I have the opportunity, for example, to share every opinion that I've ever had with Boris Johnson, which of course I don't have that opportunity at all. It's trying to get people to understand exactly what is possible so they can take part in it better. And I think politicians are really crap at explaining exactly what the job is, what it's like, the ups, the downs of it. And I think because we're crap at it, it becomes distant from people. And the real inspiration, I suppose, is wanting people not to feel distant from politics.
I mean, when I was reading it, it almost felt a bit like a love letter to politics, some of it. In your last chapter, saying why it's so important, how it's so important. That was really quite striking. But reading other parts of the book, you'd ask yourself, why on earth would anyone want to go into politics when you're talking about some of the stuff that's thrown your way? It was not contradictory, but there's quite a lot going on there.
I'm totally conflicted about how I feel about my job all the time, because I'd say that I would definitely write a love letter to politics and a love letter to parliamentary democracy. I wouldn't write a love letter to the politics of the day, I don't think. But I think that the sort of conclusion that the love letter to what politics can do is, and this is the thing I don't think people realise, is that politics entirely changed my life. Not long before I ever stepped up to hold political office. Obviously, it's changed my life dramatically in a much more direct way since. But when I look at the things that I have been gifted by society, they were all decided, whether that was the free childcare that my son had, whether it was the palliative care that my mum had, or just the option for me at the age of 19 to be able to afford to, or dare to think that I could buy a house. Everything in my life, at one point, somebody in that palace where I work sat down and remembered that somebody like me might one day exist, and that we should try and help kids who have babies young. We should try and make sure that women can succeed, and that it has a huge and massive power. And people, the reason I know that people don't realise that politics makes a massive difference in their lives is this frequent thing that people will say to me, especially people who are, and in the lockdown this has happened a lot, for the first time ever having to claim a direct payment welfare. They will say, but I've never claimed anything in my life. I feel really guilty about it. Or people say it with pride. People are like, well, I'm not like those people. I've never claimed a penny in my life. And I just always get back across to them and say, well, you have claimed, haven't you? Because everybody's claimed. So you went to a school. You almost certainly were born in the NHS, treated by the NHS. You almost, unless you're very, very young, your family definitely had family allowances that were given to you. That was a direct payment. And it's almost as if politics in the last 10 years, especially, has become about the very richest and the very poorest, forgetting and excluding the lives of everybody else in the middle. And so those people no longer feel as if their life is affected by politics, when of course it is all the time.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a really important thing to get across, that it belongs to all of us and it affects all of us. It's not for your next door neighbour who's fallen on hard times. It's you as well. The street that your next door neighbour and you live on, the army that protects the border. You don't have your own private army, do you? I mean, maybe some people do. I've not met any even that posh, even though I have met some very posh people.
You talk very movingly about the help from the state that you got, especially at the beginning of your first son's life. And actually, and this is something I definitely want to ask about later, you talk about how the influence of more women in Parliament from around the kind of 2001, 2, 3, 4, these are people that understood the pressures of childcare and understood things in a way that generations of MPs before certainly had not and had no lived experience. And it made a complete tangible difference to your life.
Absolutely. 100%. Without the women who were elected in 1997 onwards, and without them being in the room, I would not have had, my son wouldn't have been the first year to have free childcare. Both my sons, I've got one Blair baby, one Brown baby, and I think you can tell. They both have what would be called child trust funds, savings accounts that myself and my family pay into, because those were not considered to just be for rich kids, and so the government set them up for kids. I could feel when my mum was ill and dying, and I was having to juggle work and look after her and my children, I could feel people like Tessa Jowell and Harriet Harman and Margaret Hodge. I could feel that they'd sat in a room and made demands about my ability to have paid carers leave, or to take time to look after. You can take like 6 weeks carers leave, and I could feel that one of them had to do it, and had come into the office one day and said, come on, women are having to look after their parents and their children, and they're losing their jobs and they're quitting their jobs. I could feel that my job and my security was being protected by those women. I couldn't feel it at the time. Like in hindsight, I can tell that that's what it was. At the time, I was just ever so grateful that every single time I went to stumble, that somebody was there and they put a step in front of me instead of a hole.
Yeah, you talk. There's an anecdote about when Harriet Harman, you go up to her and say, how did you keep going? And she said, well, it took me 9 years to get female hairdressers in the House of Commons. So, I took that as a step in the right direction, so kept going. So it's clear. I'm sure we'll talk about that aspect of it more, not the hairdressing so much, but the progress of female parliamentarians. But something you just said earlier was, you think this, talking to people about the importance of politics has got worse in the last 10 years. Yeah. So I'd like to ask why. And secondly, you just gave a more brief explanation of how politics is so important, that's so expanded in the book. How receptive are people to that? Because anyone that's campaigned anytime, I have campaigned in the past for various things, and you are constantly met with a wave of politics doesn't matter. How receptive are people to your arguments, and what arguments genuinely work best?
Okay, so why do I think it's got worse in the last couple of years? I think that the political landscape across the board, the party political rhetoric over the last 10 years has othered people. And like I say, it has been uniquely obsessed on both sides with the top and the bottom. So whether that was the people at the bottom were paying the entire price of austerity while the people at the top were having a cracking time. I don't know why I keep going out of focus. I apologise. It's making me feel like I'm drunk, but I'm not. That wouldn't affect the screen. I'm no technical whiz, but I know that much. But also the Labour Party, I think it obsesses very, and in a time of austerity and seeing the kind of things I see in my constituents every day, it's hard not to become completely and utterly fixated on the people who have nothing, people who are starving, people who are homeless. But the Labour Party has had quite a lot of focus on that and the very richest and how they must be the worst people in the world. For a spell as well. And when that happens, when that is the rhetoric, people no longer see themselves, because even the poorest people in my constituency don't necessarily identify that they live in sink estates, or they quite like where they live a lot of the time and are proud of it. And so the people stop seeing themselves represented in political debates. And and therefore just feel a little bit like, oh, I'm gonna opt out. But the reason that I wouldn't write a love letter to politics in the last 10 years is that it is brutal and brittle, and it seems to be about the players way more than it is about the people. It's no longer feels like it's about them. It's about winning likes and re-up. It's like the gamification of politics. And we need the little jolly ding 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 noise as if we're Sonic the Hedgehog getting golden coins. There's quite a lot in the book where I actually compare it to Mario. That one just made me feel like Sonic, because I don't want to start another war between Sega and Nintendo. I lived through the first one. But I'd like to take, be Liberal Democrat about it and take both opinions.
Be orange and yellow, as you say.
Yeah, not quite pick a colour. But the arguments that I find work with people is, first of all, if people are really like, you get a lot, as you will know, Emily, if you go out and campaign about things, is, oh, there's no point, it doesn't change anything. Or you're all the same, you're all after the same thing. And now I like to ask people what that same thing is, because I hear that a lot, and so far nobody's been able to quite pin their tail on what that is. People have a varying different, you're all after the same thing. It's like a sort of unknown thing that we're all after. So I ask questions back at people. But I will tell people about the kind of things that were changed by ordinary people. The laws that didn't exist until somebody walked into my office and said, oh, I think this would be a good idea. And I can give lots of examples to people of ordinary folk who decided one day that they wanted to change something and then did it, because everything that ever changed is there is an example of that. It doesn't rely on people. It relies on people like me to be a vehicle, but it needs ordinary people. But I find that you can challenge people completely politely and not like you would on Twitter, that they're wrong. And you can say, I can say, well, you're completely wrong about the fact that politics means nothing, because if you were to break your arm later, you would go to a hospital that was put there by somebody fighting for it to be there. The politics is the reason that hospital was put here and not 400 miles away somewhere else. And I don't think that people don't take much convincing once but you have to also be convincing.
Yeah.
You have to sound like you believe it, and you have to speak like people speak. One thing I really, really hate about politics at the moment, and the Labour Party definitely has fallen foul of this in recent years, is the idea that you can't disagree with somebody.
Yeah, I was just about, I just wanted to ask, and it's something I've thought about a lot, are people too, it seems so many politicians are too scared on actually having an argument and leading an argument. There's the not wanting to disagree, offend, but politics is also about winning arguments, having arguments, defining arguments, not just saying things you think people will offend the least amount of people, surely.
Yeah, you've got to live with the fact that you might offend some people. Don't be purposefully offensive, obviously. And don't go out to say something to be offensive, because that's what the current Tory strategy appears to be. It's like, we're going to go out and say something offensive because we like the reaction, and some people will really, really like it. It's very populist, UKIP-y sort of way of behaving. But the idea that working class people can't be challenged is obviously thought out by somebody who's never met any of them. Because, who doesn't love a row about things, and who doesn't love trying to win a row and lead out and win an argument on something? And I think that it's okay if people disagree with me. And people write to me all the time. Conservatives write to me all the time and say, I don't agree with hardly anything that you say, but I appreciate that you say what you feel and think is right. and you do it with passion and conviction. And I defend your right to do that. But I mean, the best example I can ever think of is that a woman on the doorstep said to me, it was just after Romania. Do you remember when Keith Vaz went to the airport to welcome that one Romanian man who arrived? There was meant to be a massive influx of Romanians arriving
yes.
the European Union, yeah. And Keith Vaz did a sort of welcome committee, and then one man got off the plane. This is nothing to do with Keith Vaz. However, there is some anecdotes about him in the book.
There are.
I remember this. I was door knocking, and a constituent of mine said to me, "The trouble is, I'm not a racist, but I am a bit worried about the Romanians coming over." And I said, "Oh, well, why are you worried? Like, what's worrying you?" I don't need to immediately go, "Well, you actually are a racist. That sounds really racist to be worried about Romanians." I said, "Well, tell me why you are worried." And she said, well, she'd read that in the people who were coming over had been trained to steal from supermarkets. Like, they were going to send children over to pickpocket and make a living here, then go back to Romania. And she didn't feel that that was fair, and that wasn't, a good thing to be happening. So I said, I'm going to repeat back to you what you just said to me. You think that in Romania, which is quite a deeply religious country, that in schools, they've got like a mock Tesco, and they are teaching children to pickpocket in a mocked up Tesco. And she said, well, no, when you say it like that, it does sound ridiculous. It's like that. Well, of course it's ridiculous. I was just like, that is what you've read is at best a complete and utter fallacy, and at worst it's sent to make you feel hostility towards people who are just like you. And she was like, oh yeah, I suppose you're right. Like, you can have those conversations without having to just immediately have a massive pop-up.
Have an outrage, yeah. I mean, you can have them in person. No, online is, this is and this is what I wanted to ask about, because
that's harder.
If I look, as I do now, increasingly infrequently at something like Twitter, it is people pouncing on something that someone has said. They are professional outrage merchants. Yeah, they will, even if it's just, in some cases, just a very poor choice of words, I can guarantee it will be, I can't believe X has said Y, this is a disgrace against ABC. It's like, oh my, what is the point of this? Lots of the people get lots of likes, lots of retweets, I'm sure, but that is, I mean, it's crap for a kind of actual debate. It doesn't change, as far as I can tell, anyone's mind. No. And
it's very, very difficult, because like sort of stunt-based politics, or like riding out with an opinion the crowd will like, there's an element of keeping your base and your people happy and striving forwards in any political movement that I wouldn't seek to undermine. But yeah, if you're in the manner of changing hearts and minds, being just outraged with people, there is no good faith left on Twitter. So you can't accidentally say something and then say, so this happened to me today. I had said something about how I'd got some death threats, and somebody, another person came in, and she was just like, oh yeah, but did you stick up for X, Y, and Z when they got death threats? And I went back and I just said, well, of course I did, but why are you pitching me against them? And she was like, because they tell the truth. And I was just like, okay, well, that it's nice of you to use this as a vehicle to give your opinion when I was talking about my death threats. And she came back to me and said, do you know what? I'm really sorry. That was an awful thing to say and do, and I apologise. And I said, no worries, I'll delete what I wrote, you delete what you write, because you're just going to get a load of shitty stuff anyway. So, but that is so rare. that happens. Where that's happened to me like 4 times since the internet was invented, and it is just absolutely phenomenal that, but the people who take offence at what you have said without properly questioning you, and seeking to give you, first of all, the good faith that they may have misunderstood. And that does happen. People will private message me on things and say, I read this, and can you just clarify a few things? Because I've seen people saying that you're, whatever today's flavour of terrible human is. I just want to clarify. And I say, this is what I think, and they might not agree with me, or they might do, but I'll have a conversation. But that's usually in private. But the people who will then attack you will act with no bad faith and just attack you and say, oh, this is terrible. X, Y, and Z is, you are a whatever name. They couldn't be convinced by you when they were seeking for you to fail and to have a reason to attack you. And so you just have to ride over that. I just have to say, I just don't, there's nothing I can do to convince you. And so I'm not going to try, but I am going to try and talk to the people I can convince. And loads of politics has to be that. And we should stop pretending, and quite a lot of the things I'm trying to say in the book is we should stop pretending that there is a solution that works for everybody in any policy, that it doesn't have an upside and a downside. Why do we pretend that everything is land of milk and honey, where there is an inevitability that any change rubs somebody badly? And we've just got to be honest about that and say, but we've had to make the decision that, this is better for the group. But it doesn't, there are some people who cannot be convinced, but that is a tiny fraction. Yeah. Most people can be convinced, and they want to be hopeful. So, yeah, I mean, you just have to just try and, I tend to just, like, if I say or do anything, I then just, like, go off Twitter for the day and just let them all fight it out. And then I feel somehow the wine that you're drinking while you're doing that, it tastes even sweeter.
I'm sure.
Knowing that there are people having an absolute Barney, and you're not.
No, you're one of the many times that your husband appears in the book is when he talks about how you wake up first thing and have a look at what the reaction is to what you've done the night before, and how you seem to be interrupting his sleep. There are lots of people I want to come to who lots of stuff in the chat. The kind of, there's people talking about the rosette on a donkey type thing that you talk about in your book, about the safe seats breeding. Do they breed complacency? You, of course, turned what was a very, very tight marginal into now a very, very safe seat. But that's it. Is it changing?
Yeah.
And there's, by the way, there's another question I wanted to talk to you about when you said outrage and Labour Party. I wanted to ask whether you think the Labour Party can sometimes be a little bit too negative or miserabilist, or very and you said this in other interviews about how it might need to tear up, and how actually if you're ever going to win in politics, you do need to appeal to more than just the people that you're very quite understandably most concerned about. But sorry, there were two completely different issues there, but I wanted to get
so the safe seat thing, the answer is yes, I do think it is changing. And you hear politicians saying it all the time, there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. And they're sort of saying it in a hope that somebody says there is, and it's your one, so that they can feel better. Does my bum look big in this? I do think it is changing. And I think that anybody who takes their voters for granted is a fool who will inevitably one day pay the price for that. So, I mean, it's very hard to say when you look at the pattern of by-elections, because by-elections are always a bit weird, and because people aren't electing governments, they feel freer to behave in a different manner.
Yeah.
So that said, the sort of a result in Chesham and Amersham, it was spun as being about HS2 or being anti-housing, but I listened to any answers the day after the by-election, and all the people from Chesham and Amersham, it seemed, had rung into any answers that day to give their opinion, and they were all saying that, we know it wasn't going to stop HS2, and we know we can't stop the housing, but actually we're just a bit annoyed that our views are never considered by the party we always vote for.
Yeah.
And that is the same in red wall seats, if we were to use that terrible terminology. It's the same. It's like, well, it feels like we vote the same way and nothing ever changes. And so that will tip the balance. Now, who knows? In a general election, people behave completely differently. But I do think that the idea of a safe seat is starting to crumble a little bit, and so it should. I feel it serves people poorly for their seat to be safe for any other reason than that they have a brilliant member of parliament. And there are lots of examples of where that is the case. You can have a safe seat with a brilliant member of parliament who's really active and keeps constituents at the forefront of their work. But there are lots that just take the votes in certain areas for granted. You can see it at election time when politicians do the chicken run, and this tends to happen more recently in the Tory party. I'm sure it happened when the Labour Party were more popular, where a politician moves from a marginal seat to a retiring MP's safe seat and makes up some absolute bullshit reason why they had to do it. And it is entirely because they think, I'm going to take those, I want the easier life. I would much rather have a marginal constituency. I think having a marginal constituency is the best because it makes you work really hard. And my constituents are proper like shop arounders. That it's been in my lifetime. It's been Tory, Labour, Liberal, Democrat. It's been a bit of everything.
Can I just interrupt you? Sorry, because I wanted to bring in what is a very pertinent question to this, which I'm sure you are asked about a lot. Alan Lewis, are you there? And can I get you to raise your point on electoral reform? Sorry to have. If you're not,
Alan,
hello.
Hi, Jess. So something I'm really interested in is electoral reform and about how, I live in a very safe seat. I won't name my MP, but I feel like it doesn't matter how I vote. It's going to make no difference. They have sort of 70-80% of the vote. It's not going to make any difference. And my previous seat was the other party, and it was exactly the same. And I wonder what you think about whether we want a more proportional system, something like mixed member or something like that, that means that more people, particularly people who happen to live in a safe seat just by random chance, actually feel a bit more enfranchised with the system.
I want people to feel more enfranchised with the system. I would never sign up to the idea of a direct PR system, because I think that the parliamentary democracy that we have in our country is unrivaled in the world for the connection between a constituent and a politician. And I would never want to be a politician that didn't have a direct responsibility to my constituents. I wouldn't ever be interested in being a sort of non-regional list partner. I want constituents, and I would hate the job without them. But the Scottish list system is a mixture of the both, isn't it? So I think that there's real potential in that regard because of people like you needing to be enfranchised. What I don't agree with, which is everybody's favourite topic at the moment, is the idea of electoral pacts and some sort of big, massive coalition, because I think it takes the piss out of voters as if they're not clever enough to do that work themselves. And it feels to me always like very southern people trying to stitch up how other people should vote, and making backroom deals about you stand there, you don't stand there. But it's not on us to decide who people can and can't vote for in their different areas. I think it actually disenfranchises people more. And I think that there's ways of doing it without saying, well, we won't stand candidates against you and we won't stand candidates against you, because that just seems like a massive stitch up to me, and I'd hate that. And it'd make me vote in protest against it. And I think that the voting public are better at this than us. I think they know when to tactically vote, and I speak as somebody who took the seat off somebody who got it through tactical voting. And so I'm not for that sort of system, but I do think that we need some form of electoral reform. The way that the seats are even split up at the moment is deeply unfair, where my constituency has, in some cases, 10 times the number of residents as other people's seats. So actually my constituents' votes matter a tenth as much as somebody else's, and that's not fair either. So there's all sorts of things that we should do to have electoral reform, but I would never want a system where I didn't have a constituency.
Thanks very much, Alan. Thanks, Jess. There's a great point by Andrew just now in the chat, which is really talking about how parties are coalitions internally. But can I just I would love to go back to Charlie Massey to ask your question about the interview that Jess may or may not have seen last week, and also, by the way, what you thought of it, Ms. Cummings.
Oh, I was going to have a nice silent evening of listening. It's been really interesting. Yeah, sorry. I mean, let's bring the big fat Cummings in the room. I was quite surprised watching it. That some of the things, perhaps it's because he hasn't got a party and he is an agitator, but there were quite a few parts that sort of resonated with me, particularly his comment about politicians receiving power based upon the success they have within their party rather than their representation of their constituency. And it really chimes with what you were just talking about now. And I wonder what you thought about how much he will sully the waters or change the next term.
Well, I'm going to make an admission here. I didn't actually watch it, but I have had many run-ins with him in person, so I can imagine what he was saying. But when I say run-ins, actually, that makes it sound like we were having rows. In some cases, we were having disagreements, but not. In some cases, we were discussing things exactly as you describe. It is absolutely true that people's success in politics relies way more on their patronage to their political party than they do to the people. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Some people are brilliant with the people, and therefore their party recognises the need to capitalise on that. Sometimes they don't. But absolutely, the game of politics in Westminster versus the game of politics in the country are two completely different things. And it's sort of horrible. In the book, I wrote about how Conservative members of Parliament, they sort of have to pay their dues in different seats. Like, so if you're going to be basically one day given a plum safe seat in Surrey, you first of all have to go and stand in like the Glasgow docks, and which is exactly what Jacob Rees-Mogg did. I think he stood in the Glasgow docks and then, you know, sort of had a sort of, although to be fair to him, not a safe seat. It was Labour at one point. But you have to sort of pay your dues. And there's sort of like this idea that is a good thing to do. Like, oh, you know, it's proving your worth, but it's only proving your worth to the party.
Mm.
It's treating the people who live in both of those places with utter contempt. In the first instance, as if they're a game to be played, so that people can climb a greasy pole. And in the second incident, it is literally like, oh, your votes just are for this nice chap who's done us a solid and stood in Glasgow to get a job. Like, it's utterly despicable, in my view, that happens. And I'm not here to defend necessarily the way that, you know, these things can be played out in the Labour Party as well. We don't do that particularly, but it's also not perfect. So I don't like it, and I would agree with Dominic Cummings entirely on that point, but not on very much else. But do I think that he's going to actually be an agitator for change? I think arguably already was, and I think his moment might have passed. No, actually, not for a while. Maybe eventually, but not at the moment. Because I think actually from what I've seen of that interview in clips is he sort of hung himself a little bit, and not even a little bit, a lot. And I think that whilst a lot of people who didn't like him are like, oh, actually I agree with him on that, I'm not sure he's reaching the masses beyond them knowing he went to Barnard Castle. And I'm not sure that the Tory party are paying him that much mind.
No, I hear you, but I think a little bit like the wallpaper, the cost of the wallpaper. It's whether it was the right thing to be doing around the Huddersfield by-election, I'm not sure. However, it's now sat in the public psyche, isn't there? And I think some of those things that came out of the interview, I mean, let's not have that conversation, because I can hear people, I can see in the chat that people are wanting you and Cummings to come up against each other at some point in the future thinking.
But the thing is that me and Dominic Cummings wouldn't come up against each other actually, because I mean, on certain issues we would absolutely fall out. But if anything, I think that, you know, there's lots and lots about the structures of how people campaign that Dominic Cummings and I would agree on. I just don't believe that you should just lie to people.
No.
That's I'd say where we would differ, is that I also think that fear is much easier to spread than hope, and any fool can do it. But I don't think he is a fool, and I think he could spread hope. It's just he's got to choose to do that.
Thanks very much. Can I just ask directly, Tessa, do you want to ask the question yourself that you just put up? If so, please do, or I will. I mean, there are lots of stuff, great questions you said in the chat. I want to ask the one about how you keep going, Jess, but it was the last one you just made that I'd love an answer to.
I've just had, I'm not recovering from latitude. My children just arrived back smelling like you would not believe. But anyway.
Lovely, Tessa.
Share that with you. No, my point was kind of following on from that, which is, you know, I know we've got Matt on the call, so, you know, we've gone post-truth. Have we gone post-character in politics? Is it going to come back?
Have we gone post what? Sorry, you broke up slightly.
Post-character, post-behaviour.
Look, I think it will come back, because I think that the people will demand that it comes back, and I think that Boris Johnson is a tiny bit of an anomaly, but there is a difference between the left and the right in this regard, is that the right are much more entitled to behave poorly than to get away with sort of bad behaviour, because there's a sort of that they'll let themselves off and they don't self-flagellate about it in a way that certainly people expect me to be literally as pure as the bloody driven snow. And if I say or do anything wrong, I think that, you know, that would be the end, but then I would make it the end for me. So if I did something like lied about having a donor paying for a part of my house to be done up, and I was found out, I genuinely would not be able to cope with that. I would resign, because it would just be, I mean, I wouldn't do it in the first place because for that reason, for that horrible fear reason. And Boris Johnson, the funny thing about him, and I'd say David Cameron suffered from the same thing as well, is that there's no real risk to them in the mistakes that they make, or if they had to resign, or if they were got rid of in shame. There's no massive risk to them. Like, my whole livelihood would be gone, and my reputation, and I would not fail up. I would not fail up into a massively £1 million green seal job, sadly. And so there has been this era of politician, very specifically from the same class, who the risk to the country is of no consequence to them, and that has allowed them to behave incredibly poorly. Do I think that the country prefers people with good character? It's funny, because people think that Boris Johnson is really, really popular, and when people on the doorstep say to me, I didn't like Jeremy Corbyn, so I voted Tory, and I say, do you like Boris Johnson? And they're like, oh God, no, not really. But people know that he's a liar, so constantly going on about him being a liar, people know it's baked in. But do they want a stream of liars, one after the other? I think that the answer is no, and I think that he has been given a huge amount more latitude because of circumstance and, in fact, character that other people wouldn't be given. So no, I hope not.
can I, as you just talked about Jeremy Corbyn, can I take you back a few years in the Labour Party? Is that okay, Jess?
It's very triggering.
You talked about elements of internal party culture you've talked about today. There's a lot about it in the book. There is no doubt that something went very, very wrong internally in the Labour Party over the course of a few years. On many levels, you talk about the failures of independent processes of investigating sexual misconduct. The Labour Party was found institutionally anti-Semitic by the statutory body. It is what if you could try and pinpoint what is it allowed those things to happen in the Labour Party? You talk about, because there's the difference between dissent and loyalty and not blind loyalty, but there were clearly things that were very unacceptable to a huge amount of people, but it wasn't enough for them to leave the Labour Party. And I'm not saying that's the right or the wrong decision. I'm just saying, there are a huge amounts of tension there. But what is it that saw those types of things happen without, to a lot of people from the outside, I guess, they said, well, why isn't anyone doing anything about it?
I think that there is the reasons why it happened. There is a historic issue in the Labour Party, and that it likes righteous opposition, and so it's always a fertile ground for the righteous amongst rather than the active amongst. And in the history of its whole existence, it's hardly ever been in power, so it's no wonder that it finds its comfort zone in that area. And I think that the sort of backlash from the years of both success and failure, but relative success off the back of the Blair Brown years, it felt, and how that ended, no one could, I don't think argue that was good, but it basically felt like it had to genuflect and apologise and be sorrowful, and that was fertile ground essentially for this idea that being right matters more than changing people's lives, and the institutional anti-Semitism, the only thing that I can say about how and why that takes hold in the Labour Party, I think more so than, not necessarily absolutely, it exists everywhere, no doubt about it, but more so is that it is a proxy for being anti-Western. And the Labour Party has a long history of sort of, the desire to, like, I was raised by a man who, like, I wasn't allowed to drink Coca-Cola or watch any American TV, and he would describe it as the evil empire. So that existence within the Labour movement, the idea of this sort of capitalist.
I guess I think that point, I think, is, I get. My question was more really, whatever the reasons for how it took hold, it managed to take hold, and the massive electoral defeat meant a change of direction, but it went into an election like that.
Oh yeah, I suppose for people like me, it was the idea that you have to try and salvage what is left of you, the entire thing that you write a love letter to, the entire movement that you feel. I mean, there is nothing in my life that was ever good, or any liberty that I have that wasn't given to me by Labour politicians. And I'm gonna give a shout out to some liberals, as they used to be called, or some of the things that I certainly take for granted now. And I suppose it was trying to salvage what you could keep of that movement, but it was horrendous. It was a horrendous time of deep horror and shame. And also, I suppose, the banking on the fact that the country, again, relying on voters to do the right thing. And to be honest, I always rely on voters to try and do the right thing. Sometimes I'm disappointed, and sometimes I'm not. And in that case, I wasn't.
Tough when that means it's your party that's lost quite a lot. But
of course, and I think that when my party loses, the country loses. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a member of it.
No, it would seem strange. It seems strange if you didn't think that. Can I am sorry, I want to use my prerogative to ask this question. When I looked back at when you very kindly did the thinking for us in April 2020, a couple of days before the first hybrid parliament started, and you were saying we're going to have these screens, we're only allowed 50 MPs in the chamber, you didn't know how it was going to work. My basic question is, do you think it's worked?
No.
Do you think that Parliament has become far, far, far too irrelevant over the course of the last 15 months? And what is it going to do about it when you start returning? Because you've had, not to come across too libertarian, but you've had a period of kind of government by decree, government by press conferences, completely ignoring Parliament. What are MPs going to do about it?
Very difficult, because I was born into politics in the era of Bercow, who, if you wanted to find somebody who could write a love letter about parliamentary democracy and Parliament, he would write it would be like all of Shakespeare's sonnets put together. It's very, very different at the moment. It hasn't worked, in my view. It doesn't work. And there are some things about it that I think we should, are absolutely fine and suitable to be carried forward, that make people's lives, make politics more available to other people. Like, the sort of use of proxy voting is perfectly reasonable within reasonable circumstances. Although I had to hand my vote over. There was a vote on abortion, and I gave it to a man to vote for me, and I literally felt like I was killing my mother all over again. I was just like, I can't believe I'm going to allow you to walk through the lobby on this. But I mean, he was going to vote how I told him, but it felt wrong. It did feel wrong. But no, I think that you're absolutely right. The executive rules, the executive pays no mind to what Parliament thinks, says, or does. And I don't think it has worked. And Parliament has to get back to, because there's loads of Parliament that people don't see, where you get to hold ministers to account, that just hasn't really been happening. Like all of the debates in other chambers, all of the select committees, even everything, whilst it's been done to the best under bad circumstances, it is. I wouldn't want it to continue for another day.
Do you think that when you come back, I assume in more normality in September, that will actually change, or do you worry, as some might do, that you've just lost a lot of relevance, and I mean, partly because there was seemingly no opposition for months to any of the government's COVID regulations. Is it?
I mean, I think that. It will come back, actually, but I'm not entirely sure how much the public thought we were that relevant, if I'm perfectly honest, Emily. I think that's charming that you thought so. I feel touched.
Debatable point, but you at least occasionally voted on stuff, is my point, really. That you did at least, in theory, have some power to vote stuff down.
Also, you've got to remember that you're coming off the back of a time when, ever since I was elected, certainly, and for some time before, people had tiny majorities, if they had one at all. And so voting, actually, my vote counted, if not not the same, if not more than the Prime Minister's vote in many of the votes that I have taken part in. And we are just not in that era. Boris Johnson has a massive majority and a very, very, very compliant, weak party who will basically do as they are told in lots of cases. And so it's easy, we could force votes on everything and lose over and over and over and over again. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that to make the very serious points. I absolutely think that we should, and that we've got and that Parliament's relevance is so deeply important, and when it's gone, people will wish that we could have it back. I agree with you entirely.
That's nice. I've just realised, as I knew it would be, the time completely ticking. There were two super quick questions, if you don't mind. Firstly, since the last time we spoke, the domestic abuse bill's become law. It got royal assent after, in no small part, thanks to the campaigning that you've done for quite a few years in and out of Parliament. If you could pick the one, if you were back at your days working at the Black Country Women's Refuge Aid, the one thing that this bill will make the biggest difference?
The thing that will make the biggest difference is that there is now a legal duty for every local authority area to provide refuges. Before the bill, local authorities had to provide adult and children's services and bins, and now women's refuges and women matter as much as bins. So I'm now campaigning for us to matter as much as cars, and one day will matter as much as yachts. And that then women will have finally reached the zenith.
Take their place.
As important as a royal yacht.
I saw you on TV last week. I put the TV on and you were on TV, and you were saying councils employ people to go and check people's cars and parking wardens, but they don't go and check that women are not being sexually assaulted or harassed on the street. So it was one of your many brilliant turns of phrase, which as so many in the book, my colleague Mark was saying you would win the Oscar for footnotes, because I co-wrote a book once. The footnotes were a pain of 2 months of torture. Your footnotes talk about how you got confused between MSM, meaning mainstream media, and sex with men, which caused no doubt some confusion when you were.
All left-wing people suddenly were really homophobic because they were slagging off the MSM, and I was like that because I worked in sexual health services. That meant men who have sex with men. I was just like, what? Why are you being so awful? And then I realised.
As some people will know, unfortunately, we come to. There's so much in the chat. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get to it all. Lots to talk about electoral reform. The question about how you keep going and what keeps you going, apart from finding the funny things in things.
I mean, the gentle lilt of the place and the privilege of I'm really nosy and I'll get to be part of people's lives, but genuinely my constituents keep me going, and if I don't spend enough time in my constituency office with the brilliant people who walk in, I would give up. There's a woman called Anne who comes into my office and she's like, oh Jess, it's such a lovely spot, and it's literally a very crappy office in a row of shops where lots of it is empty. She's like, I love it here, it's such a lovely spot, Jess. And it's people like Anne who just keep me going, and you can do anything when you've got good humoured constituents who think you're doing a good job.
Constituents in the book, your constituents just come alive, and they are wonderful. Talking my last question, and I'm sorry we're over time, but some people will know I'm an Olympics nut. I was cheering on a guy from Birmingham, Joe Fraser, in the gymnastics today. Superb performance. Are you watching? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But if you were going to compete in one Olympic sport for Team GB, what would it be?
Well, it's funny you should say this, Emily, because before the 2012 Olympics, in around 2008, I decided that I thought that if I could probably train to win a gold medal at the 2012 Olympics in archery, because it doesn't look like you have to be very fit to do it. But then my husband told me that I was an idiot and that actually you have to be really fit to do archery. So there is a shooting one as well, which looks like you just lie down. I could just be lying down as well. I am totally watching it today. I've been on Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, and the whole day I've had it on in the background. It is. I successfully timed having both of my babies with an Olympic Games, so that when I was off maternity leave, I could just watch it all the way through. I absolutely love it, and I know nothing about sport, and I don't know what the Omnium is, and yet I find it so thrilling.
It's amazing. You wait next week.
I cannot wait for the cycling, and I never thought that I would say that. I absolutely love every horse ballet. Love it. Love them all.
Well, tomorrow. Dancing horses tomorrow, so we will all watch it. I'm sorry we've run out of time. There is so many people in the chat saying that, you know, we'd love to have a beer with you, a tea with you. So all I can say is I hope we can persuade you when we are allowed to all be back. Well, we are technically allowed, but when we are all comfortable back in person, if we can invite you in the newsroom. Thank you for as I said earlier, a wonderful love letter to politics and what it can do to those of us that think it's important.
I just want to say thank you as well. I want to say thank you to Tortoise because there are 2 laws that I have that I'm trying to successfully change around domestic abuse and sexual harassment, and it was Tortoise who picked up those stories and kept on running with them and kept on and so universities, sexual harassment in universities, absolutely exemplary, and women who die suddenly who've been victims of domestic abuse, the work that Tortoise has done on that has been absolutely exemplary, so thank you to Tortoise.
Well, I thank you. The hidden homicides and campus justice, please look at them on our website. They are superb bits of journalism. I couldn't agree more, Jess, and thanks for your support in them, because change needs to happen, and it only happens with people like you. So I leave you all this evening. Thank you very much. Have a lovely Monday. Get up early to watch the sport, and we look forward to seeing you at another one soon. Bye, team.